It's been a while. Wonderful to meet you again. Have I ever told you my name? Have I ever mentioned who is behind all these discoveries and episodes? Maybe I haven't, but I think it's high time I did, especially for this particular topic. My name is Isaac. Even though it's linked to a lot of biblical issues, especially the patriarch Isaac, my name really reminds me of one very important personality in the world of physics and even in mathematics. But before I quickly zoom into such a figure, I'd like to welcome you once again to this all-important episode, Living the Law. You are aware that the law is one of the most contested issues in the whole world, because it appears, inasmuch as laws have been given, laws have been repealed and amended over time, the world keeps deteriorating morally, economically, and even politically. But in this episode, we discuss how important it is that we recognize the importance of order and living in harmony with the natural order of things. A time ago, God spoke to Moses and told him, "You shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I've talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, whether it's gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourself these." After proclaiming the Decalogue, as we have seen in previous episodes, it was imperative that the people now connected themselves with God. And as we have seen, they quickly asked Moses to be an intermediary between God and them. From that moment, God himself decided to give laws through Moses to be transmitted to the people. And that is what we have come to know as the Covenant Code, which were intended to regulate the lives of the people of Israel. And that is, in extension, to us. Of course, there are adaptations, especially with regards to the topic we are going to discuss. In short, these were practical applications of the Ten Commandments. But before we become so theoretical and even more theological, like we do always, it is important for us to dig deeper. Are these things really significant today? Well, the only way to answer is as we go through these very important bullets. As we discuss, we'll try to unravel how it is to live the law. Basically, how to manage violence, how to live in society, and how to gain victory. It doesn't end there. So far as we have connected ourselves with the biblical narrative, we will try to understand the law in itself, the law of retaliation, then of course, that which is connected as well to reward and punishment. How is it to live with the law? Or, better put, how do we live the law? One way or the other, it is equally important to discuss the figure I started with. And his name is Isaac Newton. Who have we come to know as Isaac Newton? Well, I love my name, but the more I look at the life of this person, I love it the more. Of course, we are all Isaac. Well, he's more in terms of the mathematics and the principles of life. And even more interesting, Isaac Newton was really a religious and a very inclined man in terms of discoveries in the Bible. In a nutshell, he was a very instrumental theologian in his own rights. When Newton published his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica theories about the universal truths that govern every fallen apple, every planet, and even the movement of our own bodies. Quite similarly, and even more importantly, God gave Israel laws. They weren't abstract rules, but foundational principles for life, society, and worship. Before I get deeper into our discourse for the episode, let me quickly highlight what really Newton's first law means. It says, an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. How important and true is this? Well, even before getting deeper into it, as a law, really is founded upon the fact that it doesn't change. Well, of course, you can practically see this in our lives. Human beings eat through the mouth, of course, unless there is a natural or biological change, which in this case is the external force. It is clear that we move as human beings forward, unless we are convinced to move backwards, and that clearly depicts and explains the law, the first law of motion. If I move further, it is no accident that human beings naturally have affection. It is the law, it's a natural order of things. And in so much important as we find in even our lives today, it is natural that females conceive. Even though more genetic engineering have brought new ideas and new practices that seem to challenge the natural order. In a nutshell, Newton very much importantly did open our eyes to the natural way of things, and that everything happens naturally unless something becomes the acting and external force to change it. It is the order of life. In the same vein, when God spoke to the Israelites, we see clearly that He didn't just give them arbitrary rules. He gave them ways to manage violence. As we perfectly explained in our opening remarks, the main idea of living the law is to manage violence as was given by God to the Israelites. There is no surprise that He told the Israelites, after giving them the Decalogue, in the 21st chapter of Exodus, anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. Well, before you are quick to judge, was it even necessary to wait to be put to death? It is very clear that the covenant code began by regulating very important aspects of the Hebrew society and even in extension to our days. What do I mean by this? Are you aware that in the olden times, especially in the Hebrew setting, as they were leaving Egypt, they had connected with the idea of slavery? And in fact, the whole idea meant that someone could be bought and used as a slave. But God, in His infinite wisdom and effort to bridge this, to curb this problem through the dissemination of the law of the covenant code, men were released after the 7th year. You can carefully go through this in the 21st chapter of Exodus. Again, women during their slavery period, if were not married, were also free after the 7th year. It doesn't end. If a man wanted to remain a slave, he could choose. And perfectly, we see that it doesn't end there as well. There was also what we call the death penalty. And how does God curb this? If you are an intentional murderer, there was a penalty for you. And the one who hurts or curses his parents had also a penalty. Again, if there was a kidnapper, such a person also had a penalty to pay. The injuries caused by other people were not supposed to be overlooked. In this case, there was an obligation of financial compensation. And for example, in the case of women, an abortion would require that a judge and the woman with her husband had to be imposed with a fine. All these laws were meant to manage violence, and we can see clearly even in our times, the lack of laws really progresses to violence. In a nutshell, the whole idea of these were just to prevent the Israelites, and in extension, even in our age, to do violence. I believe we all hate violence, and that is what God sought to prevent. What happens next is about how the covenant code, the explanations to the 10 commandments or the Decalogue, were to help the people to live in society. Let me give you an example. In Exodus 22:16, according to the NIV, we are told, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. Ask yourself, how many women would have been saved of shame if this law was still being utilized by world economies? You know, God isn't content to simply leave us with basic laws and let us apply them as we see fit. He took care to provide concrete examples so we could apply them correctly. And these examples include animal-on-animal attacks, lending and renting, and even premarital relations. Before I continue, let me quickly highlight some very interesting laws in the world as we find it today. Are you aware that there are very interesting laws in the world? Let me give you a few examples. Maybe you've heard of them. But they quickly tell us that inasmuch as the laws as we see in the Bible somewhat may appear difficult, we are living in a world which is more complex than we think. Number one, in Switzerland, it is prohibited to flush your toilet after 10 p.m. Whoa, when you ask yourself, how are people going to pee? In fact, you shouldn't flush your toilet after 10 p.m. Yes, you heard that right. Flashing at night is equal to noise pollution in Swiss country. It may not be a crime, but is certainly considered rude and can bring you fines in the extreme cases. Let's go to Spain. Are you aware that you might enjoy a wonderful holiday on the coast of Spain? You may have the sun, you may have the wonderful company of friends at the beach, but you cannot build sand castles in Spain. Castles made of sand fall in the sea eventually. Or if you are in Spain, it will cost you a hefty fine. Simply put, it's illegal to build sand castles on beaches. Well, if it's interesting, listen to this. You cannot chew gum in Singapore, especially in the cities. It is strictly prohibited. Unless, as at this time, it is being changed. It hasn't been bought or sold as at the recording of this video. talking about gums. In a bid to keep the country clean and to avoid scraping gum off sidewalks, this offense can result in £1,000 fine. Wow! And people have problems when in the Bible is recorded, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." You might ask yourself how many people live in Singapore and how they are thriving in these circumstances. Well, it gets more interesting. In Russia, you cannot drive a dirty car. And when I saw this, I just laughed. But it is a serious offense. A sparkling clean car keeps the fines away in Russia. For example, if your license plate is covered in dirt or you are caught looking shabby, you can get fined. Another very important law is found in Greece. You cannot wear high heels in some ancient Greek monuments. That's right. You cannot strut to the Parthenon or the Acropolis in Athens. According to them, high heels can chip away at the fragile stones, so flats are encouraged to preserve these historical sites. Last but not the least is the Autobahn in Germany. Are you aware you cannot walk on the Autobahn? Well, you might want to search. It makes sense why this law really exists, because the highway has no speed limits. But more interestingly, it is illegal to run out of fuel on the Autobahn. Wow! So we have all these laws in the world, and yet people live in them. You ask yourself, why then do people find it difficult to acknowledge the importance of theological laws? Well, when you really look into the rationale behind the laws I explained, it appears not just theoretical. For example, if the Singaporeans are telling us not to chew gum in their country, it is because they have seen the repercussions of chewing it. If the Autobahn in Germany is prohibited to be used by pedestrians, it is also important to know it stems from previous incidents. Well, I must have forgotten. You may have also heard that you cannot honk indiscriminately in New York. Ask yourself how many people live in New York today, and even out of that lot, how many drive cars? Imagine strolling the streets of New York and hearing not even a honk of a car. But still, people live there. The laws are working. In the days of Moses, being a covenant between God and his people, the covenant code, that is the laws, also included the way in which we should relate to him. In addition to the Sabbath rites, there were the obligations to observe feasts that remind us of our liberation from sin. More importantly, the laws given were to help the people on how to get victory. Well, before you get confused, let me explain by asking you a question. Why didn't God give Abraham the land of the Canaanites? Well, clearly the answer is given in Genesis 15 verse 16. It was because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. You see, people debate themselves over this. While in ancient times, God gave Canaan to Israel, the same merit or mercy that was given to Israel was given to the inhabitants of Canaan. After 4 centuries of grace, the Canaanites had not changed their ways, and now it was time that the land on which they dwelt and misbehaved had to be passed to Israel peacefully. Unfortunately, when God had brought Israel out of Egypt, they had not stuck to that important exchange. And in that case, they had to fight. They had to really go through self-changing in order to inhabit the land. If God had brought them out of Egypt without them having to fight, had parted the sea in two, miraculously fed them, and guided them with his angel, wouldn't he be able to give them Canaan without them having to fight? Well, he would have. In fact, he could have. God tells Israel what to do. He says, "Hear my voice, so that I may be the enemy of your enemies." He tells them to serve only him so that he may remove all their sickness. He tells them to make no alliance with the Canaanites, so as to not to worship their gods. Then while God tells Israel what to do, he promises what he is going to do. He will send his angel to guard them and protect them. He will bring his angels to go before them and bring them to Canaan, that is direction. He will send terror to the inhabitants, and he will send wasps to drive them away. He will drive them out gradually, and finally, he would now hand them over to the Israelites until they dominate from Mediterranean to the Euphrates. This was how God was going to utilize his law, and in essence, to teach his law to the people, and when they lived it, they would get victory. In a nutshell, living out the law should bring us peace and victory. Connect this to the laws of motion. Now, let me connect the second law of the Newtonian laws of motion. It tells us clearly that the force equals mass times acceleration. Every force is actually a combination of its mass and its acceleration. Don't get confused. What Newton is saying basically is every action has a measurable impact. So whatever you do has an impact on the surroundings within which you do what you did. In a nutshell, connected to what God did, whatever happened with the Israelites would now have a replicative effect of all the other nations. And that will be the magnitude of the deeds of the Israelites by following and living the laws of God. Are you aware that Christ came to explain, in order to fulfill the law, the importance of some of the miscalculated and misunderstood laws in the Bible? Let me give you a few of them. In fact, when Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount, he abolished the law of retaliation. Oh, did he? No, he didn't. He actually used the same phrase like "you shall not kill," "you shall not commit adultery," but he never intended to abolish them. In fact, he always expanded the law, improved it, and gave its true meaning. In other words, for a law like Exodus 21 verse 24, which says, "Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot," was never the true intention of the law of retaliation. In fact, the law was formulated with the intention of preventing revenge, putting an end to blood feuds and retaliation without prior investigation. Damages had to be assessed by judges, and then appropriate monetary compensation was established and paid. This was the law of retaliation. That brings me to a very important part of this episode: reward and punishment. We see that naturally everyone has the desire for revenge. But the unfortunate thing is, it's always disproportionate to the wrong we've received. We tend to say, if he did this to me, I'll do more to him. But what we are invited, as Jesus explains this, is the total opposite of what we desire. Where is the justice when we repay evil with evil? How would there be a distinction? For example, if a judge gives the opportunity for you to kill the murderer of your daughter, then what are we just opposing good with or evil with? In order to find a good way, then evil should be paid with good. But of course, the punishment to the evil one would not be overlooked. That is the basis of the law: reward and punishment. In other words, God doesn't tell us that the aggressor won't be punished. No. He only tells us that he is the one who is the avenger, but we are to hold our peace. Personal revenge is tolerated in the covenant code, but it was kept by creating the judicial system to prevent abuse. And we even find this in our current dispensation. No one can simultaneously be a judge. No one can simultaneously be a judge, the jury, and the executioner all in one. If one has to be punished, then another has to be a judge. And if another has to be a judge, then of course witnesses are to be different. When you are given evil, you stand as a witness for the judge to pass judgment. And the ultimate judge is God. The law is meant to bring us peace. In several ways, as we find ourselves in the world, we are presented with laws that sometimes are not really comfortable with us. But we live in them anyway, because we believe they are bringing justice. Why not the laws of God? Think about it.